Hi, are you ready?
Yes, great.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kathy Gore-Fuss. I'm a painter from Olympia, Washington. I have been practicing my art for most of my life. I've been living in the Pacific Northwest at least 2/3 of my lifetime. I had a short stint living in the Midwest, and then my family moved back to Seattle, and we've been here ever since. I've done a variety of things with my work over the last 45 years. So printmaking, painting, drawing, sculpture, mixed media, and assemblages. Drawing and painting is my love, so I think I've gravitated back to kind of what I'm passionate about and what I've enjoyed most. I work in the landscape of my interest in nature, and about 10 years ago I decided to take a workshop that was focusing on plein air painting. Plein air means, in French, outdoors. So working outdoors is essentially, it's a fancy word for standing outside and working. There seems to be a resurgence in a lot of people wanting to do plein air painting recently. So there's competitions, there's clubs, there's groups of people who are going out and just making the choice to work outdoors. And so our source material is nature. My style of painting outdoors is to stay in the woods for hours upon hours. So sometimes I'll talk with artists and it seems like they take pride in how quickly they can complete a painting. And I'm definitely not in that category. I would say the bulk of what you're looking at here takes me anywhere between a month or longer to from start to finish. It's not about, for me, it's not about efficiency, it's about time. The time that the woods transform in front of me. We've got seasonal changes. We have different lighting from the morning until the dusk. So really, my heart is in observational work. So what's happening while I'm standing out there in the woods? Initially, I started working just in the warmer months, and then I decided that wasn't going to be very productive for me, and I don't like working from photographs at all. So then I just started working year-round. And so regardless of the climate, the temperature, and whatever weather is going on, I still seem to be able to figure a way of getting outdoors and huddling up against a cedar tree so that I'm kind of protected from rain, and I have a collection of different umbrellas that I can rig up on the back end of my pickup truck, and that just allows me to thrive in any of the conditions. I have found that if I work in the winter and it's in below 32 degrees, my paint isn't as malleable and is harder to kind of move around. It's a material that oil-based, so it's working a little bit better under warmer conditions, but that doesn't prevent me from standing out there. I have learned that I can paint under 32 degrees for about 2 hours before my hands are completely frozen. So in my community, people are used to seeing me outdoors like, oh, wait, there's someone painting, oh, that must be Kathy. So let me talk just a little bit about my approach with oil painting. I primarily work on canvas. If I'm working on a larger format, that's going to be stretcher bars with canvas. Some of the smaller pieces, this one is an example. This is linen that's been glued in it or adhered to a board, so I refer to it as a linen panel. So canvas is set up so that as you're working on it, there's some give, you've got some bounce on that surface, and that's something that can be very important to certain painters and the styles of how they're working. I seem to be able to go back and forth between having a little leeway on the surfaces that I'm working and working on a solid, hard surface. One of the techniques that I have always relied on in regards to how I apply my materials, whether it's oils, pastels, drawing materials, whatever, graphite, is that I tend to be additive and then reductive. So I'll put something down and then I'll take it off. Right, it seems kind of crazy, but it allows me to make a mark and not be as attached to that mark, thinking that it's going to be the absolute critical component to the image I'm creating. It allows me to make marks freely and confidently without concern that, oh, maybe I don't have that quite right, or let's say I'm working from the figure. It's more as if I sketch my way through my lines rather than that I pick my brush up or a pencil and I draw confidently and singularly. So when you look at how I've applied material to the surface, be it charcoal, walnut ink, or oil painting, then I have this tendency to have kind of aggressive mark making. The other aspect of how I think I see my work and how I am currently seeing and relating to the forest is space and light are a concern of mine. One of the things you discover as you work are that just you start looking for certain things. In a lot of my paintings, when I started in the forest, it was sensing the complexity and almost the complete chaos that's happening in nature. Yet how much nature is very collaborative within itself, so that there is a large tree and then it drops cones, and right next to the massive tree, a small tree starts up again. And so there's a great deal of order, and that I think our sense of the cycles of life, you know, fall, spring, summer, winter, and the beginning, the middle, and the end. So what I found myself doing originally, I guess I'd go over here. This is a good example. So if I started here, sorry, this was during winter. I was enthralled with the structure of the forest, and there's a certain amount of geometry that's going on with it's almost like the trees started showing me a scaffolding structure, whereas when I was out there in spring and summer, a lot of the linear elements of what supports foliage it is hidden. We're looking at the lushness of the leaves. So I was fascinated with how much of that I could see and how I would see through it. So this, to me, it's very subtle, and this was kind of the start of what I noticed myself doing with my work was finding these portals. So specifically, when you look at some of the earlier, this is an earlier piece, there seems to be an immense amount of chaos, but yet one way or another, I'm finding how I'm seeing through this and into a deeper section of the forest. So one simple way of describing part of what I'm looking for as an artist is that sense of deep space. I think then as I progress through my work in the forest, I'm starting to get more specific portals. So, and of course this piece is titled Portal. So again, I'm immersed, almost embedded in the forest area, and yet I'm finding one way that I can look through it and see part of this is a ship getting ready to head out of port. And in my discussion last night, I talked about how I have taken my work for 2 years and gone down to the Port of Olympia and followed Douglas fir to the water's edge as a resource, as opposed to the beautiful forest that we're walking into. So the forestry industry is huge in the state of Washington, and as I've had conversations last night, we kind of cut our way across from the East Coast to the West Coast, and wood is an important product for many different reasons in all of our lives. So, so I'm kind of jumping around into some of the my personal interests. I think all the artists in this show are concerned with the relationship to the ecology, how wood interfaces in our lives, how we respond to that, and the sustainability. So, so I'm not sure where the rest of my work will go, but there's a possibility that in the next year or two, I'm going to head over to Japan, following the Doug fir, and go to one of the largest mills that's got advanced technology, and that's where our Doug fir is heading over to be milled now. We've lost all of our local mills, and we're shipping things overseas. And just for me to have the experience of seeing where our natural resource goes and what it becomes. So that's kind of the longer arc of my interest in my work. I had to get ready for a show relatively quickly last year. It was down in Olympia in October, and I had just had a show earlier in the year, and I needed to find something that would allow me to work a little quickly. Oils take a period of time to dry, so that when you put them up on the wall, it doesn't smell like, my studio. So that's when I actually decided to explore walnut ink. And the material itself, the medium, again, it can be something that I can make. I did not, but you can gather walnut shells, you submerge them in a large pot, and you can cook things down to the point where you are able to separate some of the pigment that's within the shells and the interior skins over the walnuts, create a color similar. It would be like people have used coffee grounds and kind of spread them over their paper to get that particular color. People will take tea bags and they'll plop, plop, plop and make powder. Our own sense of pigmentation through a wide variety of materials. I think that Michael will talk a little bit about how he treats the surfaces of his wood. This is done on a paper. It's called YUPO, Y-U-P-O, and it's a very slick, almost plasticized surface. So generally when you might be approaching a watercolor, and I should also say, so walnut ink is water soluble. So it dries quickly as compared to my oils, which take a much longer time. And it allows me to work very quickly. So because the paper is shiny and I put down my ink on top of it, it doesn't sink in to the paper, it's really sitting on top of it. And so there's a way in which I discovered with walnut ink, similar to what I like to do with my drawings, is I can put certain marks down, and then I can come back with a spray bottle or, you know, just dump a bunch of water on it, and then it's gone. Yeah. And I think that I do that with my oil painting, but I take a scraper and I just scrape and scrape and scrape. So I take off everything that I have done in, say, the previous week. And I know that that sounds very odd from kind of a painterly standpoint, but you do whatever you tend to do with your painting, and sometimes people do heavy buildup, and I just tend to put things down and then take it back, and ultimately I'm looking for a surface. So that's kind of the goal, as opposed to say I'm reliant only on my marks. So taking things off is as much a mark to me as putting something down. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much.
Does anybody have a fast question? Did you get your walnut
Yes.
question?
Thank you.
Any fast question?
Just quick, the watercolor, so essentially the walnut ink are the watercolors, right?
It's not a watercolor. I would just call it I mean, they're calling it an ink. So it's like India ink. It's just water soluble.
So it's forgetting you take that off.
Yes. With a watercolor, you'd be working on a different kind of paper, and
Much
watercolors
porous, yeah.
have to be absolutely sure of what they're putting down because they can't take it off.
Thank you.
Thank
Can I
you
ask
very much, Kathy.
Quick question.
Sure.
It seems to me that so much of your work captures the sensibility of the light in the forest,
Yeah.
and that's so immediate to me. It feels very vibrant and as if we're standing there with that shimmering forest. And I know that you're there in that space over a long period of time while the light is changing. So how do you find that sense of light and decide how you want to capture it?
Yeah, Monet worked on 7 different canvases sometimes over the course of a day. So he was very time oriented with, say, a haystack. And I start off the painting without the intention of what time I'm going to select. And then as I stand there longer, the sight reveals the importance of kind of the hour or the time that I'm then responding to. So I don't start off with the specific, oh yes, I'm here from 4 to 5 p.m. and that's what I gotta capture.
So it's just a gut feeling for you, what's going
Well,
on.
I suppose you can say gut feeling, it's true, but it's also just, I think for all of us, our artwork kind of tells us what to do. So
You
if
listen.
that's what a gut, yeah, it's like you make yourself available for what seems to be transforming in front of you. And we can all think, whether we're talking about our artwork or our lives, that we know what we're doing. And I'm just not really convinced that that's the way things work. In my painting or in my life. So that's true. It's very good to exist primarily with that attitude, but I'm not really sure that that's the case.
I'm Peter de Lory. This is my work here at the museum. My work, I guess I mentioned in my intro yesterday, I'm actually from Cape Cod, which is not much unusual. It's almost an island of itself, like this area. And it's a kind of a spit of land out under the ocean. And I was taken by Lopez when about say 22 years ago or so. It was just really similar in time. It was probably within about 40 years. I think Lopez is probably like a little bit about 40 years behind.
We can say it.
Yeah, which is really great. And so I came and said, oh, this is great. So then, but there's similarities, but then it's not in a sense, because this is a very rocky outpost here.
We got bigger mountains.
Yeah, and they're much more. So I was taken by the whole sense of it. People, every time you drive down the street, everybody's waving, and it's a very eccentric community, and it was very taken. So I, without thinking, I photograph it because I photograph wherever I go. And then I love the walks I found, and I started photographing the walks, and I always love to do that. And I just kind of taking the ferry, I just became, like photography, you sort of like you taste the world. Nowadays, everybody in the world tastes the world because they have an iPhone. But those days it was like, oh, I want to take this, and it's like the act of like photographing to me. The one way of starting, you say, well, why is a photograph really interesting? Well, when you do a photograph, it's like an act of pointing. You say, hey, look at that. That's when you take a photograph. And we still do it with iPhones. You may do a burst of 80 pictures or a film, and you'll get lost in your phone again. But it's a sense of recognition. And when you're walking, it's a really place where you're solo and walking, or with a group of small people, friends of friends. You're slowed down. You're very slowed down in your world. Yeah. And when you photograph something, it's not like you're grabbing something and saying, wow, like you're Yellowstone, oh, the geyser, wow, okay, get in the car, go to the thing. This is like you're walking, you're in this thing. So these photographs a lot of them are about movement and walking and being into a space. And when you're making a picture, making a moment of time, I consider these photographs are more like more of a selected moment in time, not just one that's and you break it up. I mean, a lot of these photographs are I see something, I take one picture and I walk on. Pretty much the majority of these pictures are, maybe it was 2 or 3 because I'm on the boat and the boat's going like this one. I'm trying to get the right picture. But pretty much I see what I think is the right thing, and that's what I want to look at. I don't have to take a photograph every 25 pictures of it. This is the moment. So it's one of inclusion. I photograph very simply, the most simple element of what a situation is, rather than make it complex. Life is so much more, has so complexity to begin all the time, so why not, let's just bring it down to some, the basic part of it, And I photograph in black and white because of, it's sort of, it gets away the whole structure of the mood of the place. I'm a bit colorblind, so that sort of helps me on that respect. So it levels everything together in the same pool. And I use traditional, at the opening yesterday, I got my camera. I showed that the camera, it's a big box of a camera. It's a Hasselblad. It's like, it was made in 1948, and they made them still now. And the film goes in there, it's a roll of film, and you put it in there, and you have 12 shots for this particular camera. I have another one, the panoramic camera, which is, there's no one here on this side, but there's one there, which is twice, it's six shots. So you kind of, you wear it out, you make by exclusion, you go down to the smallest kind of, the mean and clean thing of what you're doing. So in that way, and then the materials I use is the traditional silver gelatin print, which is, that's a negative. It's put on an enlarger in a dark room with all the chemistry, and then made into big print, and dried and pressed, and all those things like they did from the 1800s. So, in some of the pieces, I've got 2 of them. This triptych, those particular negatives were so difficult that I had to scan them in a high scan twin, and then print them on a digital printer, which I'm very good at doing that as well. I just don't I choose to go back. I've chosen to go with the digital with silver from now on. And then the larger pictures, to make them in a darkroom, it's just too difficult. There's too much, and I don't want to stay up all night anymore doing that. So that's sort of the difference. Some of the work, as you see, are triptychs, where I've taken a moment and I've looked something, and I've come down and I say, oh, there's this thing, and then look at this around this. Well, I don't want it to be two pictures. I want it to tell the narrative kind of that place. So that's why that's that kind of usage I started using it's a really very it's a very art in Italian painting. I used to use the same thing. So here's one. This is about a storm in Iceberg Point. This is the walkway into the mattress. This is the trees are pushed down, so it gets a sense of this place you're going in. Some are a bit more narrative. This one's called Crossing. Maybe can you maybe move over here a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we'll end up with this there. And this tree is that the fog's rolling into it. I don't know if you know the book Sea Wolf by Jack London. If you read that book, though, this is the beginning of that book. That's why I was. Sharp reef. Oh, it's always taken by this tree, this little outcropping. These trees are going in the rock, and I have photographed this many times. And this was one day I finally kind of got. It was all jarred in the right way. So this is my most recent piece that I printed, and my favorite one right there at the show right now. And okay, in terms of how I make like this picture, I printed this a week ago. I mean, about 4 or 5 months ago. This last spring. I made the pictures, I made the prints in about 2004, right? Many times that is one of my work. This was the same. I shot this one, and it took me 5 years to print that. Right. So I really think about this as not as a quick grab. That's all put together. And there's sort of like anybody's work. All the work. We have so much. And this series is one part of. This is about half or a third of the work I have from this series of work. So there's always more stuff. But because you're always working and moving on this stuff. So. Any questions that maybe you would give?
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
I really loved it last night when you pulled up your camera and you pulled up the film and said, okay, this is what I need.
And you pointed, check at that. Yeah, it's kind of at a time in our history that we can do that now.
Okay.
Before I used to, when they say, what kind of camera do you I said, I don't know, I don't remember. You know? But now I know, because it's like, it's a real camera, you know, it's a beautiful object, you know. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
If I can remember. Well, I'm Michael Peterson from Lopez, part of the exhibition here. I'm a Northwest sculptor. We're working in wood. And my work evolves out of the process of making and develops its own logic. There's a few absolutes. My approach to surface and sense of organic form has always been grounded in the natural world. I've always tried to evoke a sense of naturalness in my work. I mimic the natural sculpting processes of nature, such as wind, water, sand, sun working away on surfaces. And that's where I take my cue from. These central to the work is a sense of landscape, object, and coastal influence. I began in 1975, the first introduction to wood. Not formally trained, wasn't introduced to boards and furniture making in a conventional sense. I started harvesting wood out of northeastern Oregon, out of a forest at about 5,000 foot elevation with my wife Jean. We were working for a small woodcraft business, and it was a great experience to understand the material in that setting and looking at, this was some lodgepole pine trees that were affected by a gall rust disease that really contorted and twisted the material around, and seeing the material in that state as a sculptural work in their own setting, it was a wonderful way to be, to initially understand the wood, and it led from that. So number of small craft objects, local regional craft fairs was the background, and have stayed with that. And I've always had a interest in the presentation of the material, and went from the smaller scale handheld objects, and always how could I present those in a more sculptural manner. Continue today. I'm still concerned about exploring the potential of the material and process, and a real interest in landscape. And so the wood allows me to explore the material terrain of the wood, as well as find myself in a landscape within the material itself. Throughout the 80s and 90s, my work focused on lathe-turned bowl and vessel forms that tried to translate and interpret landscape imagery. And that kind of served as a foundation, and there was always a hollow aspect to those objects. And that is carried over to the current work that I'm doing now. In 2003, I began a series of stacked objects, the Coastal Stack series, and I departed the lathe as a primary design tool for work, and began using chainsaw. And the chainsaw was always part of that process of starting to go from a tree to wood. I would cut blocks of wood, they'd be taken to a lathe, turned into forms that way. So I had been developing some skill with the saw, and it just led into it. By no means, I'm not a logger, never have been. I don't have much of a mechanical aptitude at all, and yet somehow I found myself working in this. And so what you're seeing largely represented in this exhibition is work done with that process, but also really focusing on the use of the madrone burl and its transformative qualities that it offers. But on that is the material is worked in its green, wet, unseasoned stage, and I take an irregular large burl. These come in 2,000–3,000 pound sizes, and we'll start to then cut dimensional blocks out of that. And then the hollowing process starts, where the chainsaw goes in and removes the inside. On larger blocks, the saw, it was 4 cuts, and I pull a solid core, it will slide out of this shell, and I can repeat that process until the dimension doesn't allow for a saw blade to pass through, such as this one on the top. When I get down to this size of material, then the material that's removed in here is just shavings on the ground, and there is no core that comes out any longer. But then is when the real fun and exciting time begins, and perhaps I'm easily entertained with just watching wood dry. Within the first period of about, depending on wall thickness, and within about 10 days' time, an example of something like this, it has gone from a symmetrical dimensional form. It grows into the organic, gathering this texture and shape shifting around, and that's, you know, just what I'm looking for. And then the next step is then now I have these objects, and I do many of them, and I'm just accumulating singular objects, and with no real intention of where they're going. And sometimes it's best not to know where a piece is going, and just allowing the work to reveal itself. So I have an accumulation of them. It then becomes the point to address surface, which is what I'm really interested in. And then I sandblast the pieces. That gives me further relief to the greater surface texture. And then I can start a pigmenting, patina-like approach to the surface, and it's layering up colors and then working back through the surfaces. And I have a fairly limited sort of palette that I work from, but it gives me a fair bit of broadness in what I can achieve from that. The use of sumi ink, bleach, and I discovered a interesting reaction on the Madrone burl in particular, that typically when bleaching an object, you use a 2-part liquid bleach, and when you mix the A and the B together, you get a bleaching effect. And at one point, I poured the A into a bottle and thought I had poured the B, I poured A into the bottle again and mixed them, and I put it on, and like, whoa, when this real intense red-orange just came out, just bleeding out the kind of the natural colors, intensifying what was already there in the material. And that kind of led to so it's, that produces some of the colors that you're seeing in the wood. And then the use of I started mixing my sumi or India ink with bleach, and I can go from a real hard black to a softer grays and sometimes blue-gray tones, just depending on, and it's random. There's no recipe for it, just however that concentration falls is how, the effect I'll get. And my wife worked with fabric, and there's always some of her dyes and things around, so there's no telling what will end up on them. But so that's my approach to the surface. And
Thank you, Michael. Do we have some questions?
Yes. When it's in the green state and then it starts to dry and make it so, do you have any control over, or do you help it, or do you just let it do its own thing?
I let it do its own thing. I can and have tried, and sometimes wanting to strap and bind things to try to, if it's going in a direction that I was thinking I didn't care for, but I've given that up and I just let it go. And it's really hard. A lot of it has to do on the layout of the material, where I'm looking for intersections of where certain grains are colliding like currents in water, and I'm laying things out as I cut the initial blocks. And I have some sense of where they're going, but not always. And sometimes I might use gravity if, for instance, if the flat sheet is starting to curl up this way, I may reverse it and just lay it over. Mm-hmm. And yet you can, the wood's going to go where it's going to go. But one point on that, it's a good question. Once that moisture has left, and that's what we're seeing here is this collapsing of the wood cells as the moisture leaves, and that's with the shrinking, much like a grape to a raisin skin sort of thing. But once that moisture is gone, they're stable. They've reached a point of equilibrium, and they do not, just continue to change.
Thank you.
How are these attached, or how do you move it, or? I'm not sure.
We got to watch that.
You watched
There's-
that, okay.
I have, up until recently, it's just a balance point, and they're freely stacked, and
Wow.
it's that.
So they're different each time?
Excuse me?
Are they different each time, or are they?
Stacked differently.
Yes.
There's this, it's a good point you brought up. There's a lot of configurations that can happen in this, and
Okay.
even when I take it down, and I may see it differently the next time I'm going to arrange it, which I try to keep that open. That allows the creative process. It just keeps happening rather than it's done and over and designed. But it helps to have some pins in public settings so things don't shift, and also certain elements are pinned together permanently and others are left free, and then they all break down and come back.
Cool, very cool. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. Now let's move over to this side.
Ready to go? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here again in this peaceful space, and thank you, first of all, again, to all the volunteers. Those of you who came this morning, we really appreciate your curiosity and care about how our work's presented and spoken about. And we're privileged to bring it to you here at the museum, which is the doors are kept open by you, and we really appreciate that and the hard work of all the staff, and Elaine and Pete Lane and Reve. So thank you for being here. I just wanted to say that this part of the exhibit is really essentially a third, and Kathy Gore-Fuss spoke, which is wonderful, and Lee and Tim and Kate installed the burner in the atrium, which reads beautifully in my mind as a whole. So we worked hard on this 3-person section in the middle of work, but we feel like there's this wonderful tonality that came together not only in this show, but in inclusion with everyone. And that was just a happenstance in many ways. We weren't aware, a happenstance, but Reve and others knew how it would read together. So we're really happy to have come together for this. And I think our part of this, it's titled From Rocky Outcroppings, began as a simple thought in my mind, thinking we from Lopez, we're neighboring islands, we need to bring our work to the neighborhood. And even though Michael and I have shown in many other places, and Peter as well, that we just feel very pleased to bring it here where it belongs in many ways, and where the materials are from, where the inspiration comes from living here for many years. So that's a very special thing. And Peter de Lory's part of that is by years of belonging here as a visitor, but also after a while the visitor part has dropped away, and I think his work shows that his sense of belonging here is very deep, it runs deep, and he's been ingrained by being here. It grew out of just a simple thought. I would love to make a proposal to San Juan Ima for this, and it began over a year ago, our conversation about it. And it's wonderful now to have it come into fruition. And we also produced a catalog as part of our project. It was a collaborative effort, and there's a beautiful essay written by Patricia Watkinson, a writer from Seattle who I've worked with before. And if the docents use that as a resource, it would be very helpful to find out more about our thoughts and our work, because it's very complete. We have statements in there, and her essay really talks clearly about where this work is coming from as a presentation. And I wanted to do this last night, and I'll do it today, but just to read 2 sentences out of my statement in the catalog, because it's early in the morning, and I think I'd be it would make more articulate sense to read from this, because it talks about how this came about in my mind together. And it begins, each of these artists, which is the 3 of us, possesses a deeply ingrained sense of belonging to the natural environment of the Pacific Northwest. And I feel like the San Juan Islands are the jewel of, they talk about this in tourist publicity, but it certainly, we know we're living in paradise, in one of the most beautiful places in the world. The work chosen for inclusion delves into the continual shaping of the Northwest landscape by forces of nature and examines nature's imprinting on us who live in the landscape. And this isn't just true for us. This is true for all of us. I think somehow, consciously or unconsciously, we find living here affects how we are, and deeply. From Rocky Outcroppings offers a significant and unique opportunity to present our work made in relative isolation. And Lopez is very quiet, there's no question. There's not much to do there except work. And specifically on Lopez Island, you can imagine the solitude afforded there brings a lack of distraction, allows for unbounded introspection and tranquility. All those things play a part in the tone and the nature of this work, just by nature. And the idea of nature for me more and more these days is not as a separate thing. We've been taught this, and we're trying to be told this by other populations, that it isn't outside of ourselves. And I realize if I trace back to my youth, I know I was a little tree hugger. I was, out in the woods all the time, like many of us who grew up in the Northwest, embedded in the natural world. And it remained intact in me, and as well as other people, I think, throughout their lives, where maybe it came and went sometimes as we entered our lives as we grew up, but in our art, in my art, and I think these 3 other artists and all of us seem to be revealing that attachment. And it's the attachment to the natural world that allows me to make this kind of work. So specifically, my work includes the 5 bronze pieces. There's one right here, and this is titled Nurse Log, Dialogue with a Nurse Log, kind of a rhyme. It's bronze. It was cast from a wood object. This log was from my husband's shop, his land where his shop is. It was just abandoned in the grass. It had that beauty that, to me, probably is the beginning of when Michael sees work in its natural environment. He sees the potential in the surface and the shape and the form, and he goes from there. But this was the same, so I dragged it home, had it in the studio for several years, and it sat in proximity in my studio, like lots of materials, to other things and piles of things, and some of them are from very different sources. They're not from nature. They're from industrial detritus. These are objects that you would have seen in the 60s decorating walls as decoration of nature. Ideas of nature, let's cast it in plastic, spray gold on it, and put it on our walls. Well, I'm attracted to lots of these things because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and probably my grandparents had things like this. But I gather things and bring them home, not sure what to do, but there's that recognition that this could be a potential element in my work. So these things began to come together just as alignment. They were placed together, and I would look at them And after a while, you realize it's actually holding some resonance. There's something going on there that isn't just two things together, but they begin to make a third thing of a whole. And so these were initially plastic objects. This was a log, and the back of it was hollowed out and very difficult to cast. So the foundry found a way, we created a back for it. It reads in the round, but we wanted to keep people protected from the object by placing it in the corner. And if it was on a larger pedestal, it wouldn't be a risky item. But this combination comes from the idea of one of the things I've just loved knowing about in terms of our own home here is this idea of the nurse logs falling in the forest. They become the beginnings of many other things, often tree saplings just sprout right out of them. Fir trees, cedar trees, and they're beautiful nurseries for ongoing growth and life. And I believe the first reference to a nurse log was that fabulous work, and I've forgotten the artist's name, but it's in the outdoor park at the Art Museum, the sculpture park, and it's laying on its side, and it must be 20, 25 feet long. And it's a living nurse log in a controlled environment. Things are growing in it. This piece, X equals X in my work, not very often, but this piece, it does do that in a poetic sense, in that I wanted to, and many of the other works too, I wanted to work with that idea of the nurse log. So that's doing that. These are prints made, the monoprints made, they're one-offs, so that they're of a series, but they're not repeatable. I don't want them to be repeatable. They're a series, and I've learned etching. I know how to do etching, but it's not enjoyable for me because of the strictness of that kind of printmaking. So monoprinting is a perfect fit for me. To every print is different from the last, but has a relationship. These shapes are repeated in the sculpture, and they're cut mylar. So I'm able to use mylar trace essentially around objects, and then cut. This is all cut out with a X-Acto blade. The mylar is inked up and can be used to run through the press. And it's become a wonderful way of working to have mylar to create shape and layers. So printmaking is many things, but for me, and for most printmakers, the best prints are layered images of discovery, where if you just keep laying down layers, you'll have a print, you'll finally get to a place where that's enough layers. And it can be up to for my prints, some of them have 7 layers. You wouldn't necessarily know that. It's also a result of the press, and I now have a beautiful large 6 foot by 3 foot bed on a large Eton press, which I use regularly, and these prints were made on that press. Because of that pressure, it ends up being really about the press, about the paper running through 6,000 pounds of pressure and what's resulting from that, which is often unpredictable. And that's what I want. I want the press to have the last say in how it looks. So these prints here are from the press. And Karen, this one is an example of a type of printing I did before I had the press, and this is called relief printing, which made without a press, off the press, by simply inking up wood and then carefully laying their Japanese and Chinese papers down on the wood and rubbing, lots of rubbing with your elbow grease, as my dad would say, to pull ink out of the object right into the paper. And in this case, it's a secret for you. The ink actually bled through the back of the paper as I was rubbing, and this is actually the result of the back of the print. And in some cases, that's true. These, I don't know if it's too much to swing, but those two prints here they're the front of the paper. Simply black ink. There's some color in this. This is printed on Chinese double Schwan paper. I'm not sure how to say it. But it's very meticulous and careful to get a very clean print. And as you can see, the more careful you are, the more you're going to get all the information that's in the surfaces of the wood. And I think both Michael and I and Peter in an abstract way, well, in a less hands-on way, is finding, it's through the exploration of the surface, whether you're working to have the patina come up or revealed in it by taking away material or being sensitive to what's there. I think there's a lot of commonality in our work. And as part of the commonality in this show is there's a sense of patina here, where the photographs have it's a patina of beauty in many ways, and sort of a respect for what we're living with, and bringing it very close to look at and up to the surface. Living in paradise on a daily basis I appreciate now more than ever, but like all of us, we can let that appreciation of where we are slip, and so it kind of brings us to the idea of how do we want to take care of our fragile ecology here, which is clearly already at risk of being loved to death, but it's certainly not too late to keep it in mind as we live here. The other bronze objects in the show, that kind of segues well into, I was starting to wonder, at this age, what am I doing? What is my work doing in a whole? And I started to think about, well, I really keep striving to find these equivalents for how I'm feeling about living and being right now. And now in this time, which is a very interesting time, and there's grief there. And I started to recognize this. Well, it's not like in the Charlie Brown cartoons, good grief, it's not like that. But it did make me think of my dad reading the cartoons on a Sunday when he finally stopped moving. And he would laugh and laugh about the characters. But in those times, that was a very common phrase. I heard my parents say, well, good grief. And now we have other things that have replaced that expression. But it's a curious use of the word grief, because often that seems to equate with, for me now, I'm grieving certain losses that we're seeing, all of us are seeing in our world environment. Maybe that's part of the equivalent, without trying to be depressing, that we need to find some way to express that. And I have a wonderful book I'm packing around waiting to finally read, but it deals with that idea that until that grief we're carrying around that all the time in many ways about many things, and that there needs to be a resolution for that in order for us to kind of surface with the right hopeful going forward. And it's not a psychology or ideas that I thoroughly understand or have thought about, but I know it's present in the making of the work. Apart from that, there's nothing more fun than being in the studio, which is almost the opposite of the grief part. And I think we're all privileged to be artists and be able to have, this is our work, is what we do, and it's your interest and attention in it is the reward to making the work, to have it seen, because we in these islands can be making work forever in solitude and it not be seen. Wherever we are, if we're in Olympia, and so having it be able to come out into the light, so to speak, is really a wonderful part of it. It's a wonderful end to the whole process, and we can go back and make other things.
Thanks a
thank
lot,
you.
Jean. That's great.
Yeah, thanks.
This celebration once, because before my press day, and I did it all with my elbow. It was really.
I think that's what my dad meant by elbow grease. It's oil-based ink on Japanese paper, and then the others are, they're arches, most of them arches and paper.
And what is the name of that book that you're going to read?
Oh.
You knew we would ask that.
You know, I'm not sure I have that by handy, but I can get back to you. It's a beautiful book. I've read a few pieces or chapter segments out of it, and it just deals with that issue. And I'd certainly be happy to send that to the.
It deals with loss.
I'm just-
Deal with loss.
Yes, absolutely, and it equates the loss of our environment to loss within ourselves and relationships and people and everything else. It's all sort of one big package. And it was given to me as a gift, and I was
Can you send that to Robbie?
yeah, I'd
You
be
can send
happy
it out
to.
us.
Yeah, it's really a good
Let's go
resource.
hear what Lee has to tell us about this beautiful big.
You ready to go?
Ready? Yes.
So my name is Lee Immonen, and I am a sculptor from Eugene, Oregon. I teach at the Lane Community College for the last 17 years full time, and I work on public art commissions for the most part when I'm not teaching. I have one piece in the show, so it's a little bit different than talking about a body of work, but I think that there's quite a bit in this piece that reflects on the way in which I approach work. So I'll kind of address some of that as well. This piece is called Burner, and I am, I guess, an Oregonian of 25 years, but prior to that, grew up in Hawaii for the most part. And so the experience of coming to the Northwest was a big change for me in terms of scenery. It's all of my artistic and creative development has happened in the Northwest in that period of time, since coming to Oregon for college. So I really feel like back in the 50s and 60s, there was an ownership of being a Northwest artist that was a little bit different, that being a regionalist artist was not just an acceptable thing, but actually something to kind of strive for. And then there was a period of time where the larger cities on the coast kind of took over and became the happening spots, and the idea of regionalism almost became like a dirty word. And I feel like that we should take that back, personally. And I think this show, the whole museum space right now with the artwork that's in here and the strength of the work and the direction of the work is both coming from but also pushing outward towards is a great reflection of the fact that that is happening, that that idea of regionalism is a strength in the work and is in fact one of the things that we have to offer, one of the ways in which we look through our lens here in the Northwest and can frame that some fairly large issues for the audience. At this point in my career, I work primarily on large-scale public projects, commission work for state agencies or communities or municipalities. But I started in the studio working primarily with wood, and I think that's always my first love. Wood will always be there. You know, I love to have my hands in material, to work with tools, and I think I always have felt like part of that is kind of an inherited desire to. I grew up working with my grandfather on little projects, and he is Scandinavian Finnish descent, and then I started thinking about, well, how much of what we do is kind of tied to where we come from as people. So I don't know how accurate that is, but it's a very romantic way of thinking about it in my head, and so I've stuck with that idea. So as my work developed, it got larger and larger and larger, and eventually when I started teaching, I started working primarily on fewer projects, but larger projects. I used to work on pieces that were in the gallery space, and we would fill the gallery with 6 or 10 pieces. And as my teaching schedule developed, I realized I just can't get to the studio every day. And so I spend more time thinking about big projects and then a very intensive time of making in the studio, which is almost always deadline induced at this point. And then there's a period of a lull where I get to think about new projects. And so far, new projects just kind of show up for me, opportunities show up. And this is one of those opportunities, a great chance to bring this piece up here and to show it in this space that seems almost to be built for it. Although I didn't realize that. I think Reve understood that, but I didn't fully understand that when the invitation was extended to bring this work back. So I'll give you a little bit of background about this piece. So burner is inspired by the old wigwam burners that were at each of the sawmills throughout the Northwest. And it was fairly common that they would saw lumber and that all of the slash or offcuts would go up a big conveyor and into a large conical shaped or cylindrical shaped rusty steel burner. And that would produce heat. They would use that heat exchange to produce steam, and that would then power the mill to continue running. And so most of the mills were self-powered at that point. They were steam run, essentially, and using their own scrap to produce their energy. And as I have kind of found my legs in the Northwest, part of the inspiration is the kind of the grandness of the scenery. My first studio outside of school was up in Portland underneath the St. John's Bridge, and it's a massive bridge designed by the same designer of the Golden Gate Bridge. And our warehouse was right at the foot of it. And we would watch the ships come through and stand underneath this massive bridge. And it was in industrial Portland. And so this is where I think that idea of regionalism can mean a lot of different things, but there's both nature and industry happening here at a scale that I have never witnessed anywhere else. So those are things that influence my aesthetic and the way in which I think about forms, that an industrial form can actually be a beautiful form. When you're driving through the countryside, oftentimes the mills have burned down or fallen apart or been grown over, but the burners will still be there. And you find these kind of hulks of metal that have landed out in the forest, and they're the remnant of that industry. They were incredibly smoky when they were functioning. The valleys were filled with smoke, and they were both progress and pollution and environmental hazard, and yet that's how we functioned in that space there for a while. They since shut them down, and most of the mills have closed. But I feel like to some degree the questions about how we balance what we're doing with materials and resources, and how we balance our need for production and our need for taking care of and stewardship of the environment are even more prevalent today, and that we're kind of caught in this space where there's utilization and underutilization happening in the same forests, and there are fires, and there are those that say let the fires burn, and there are those that say we need to be logging the forest, and somewhere in the middle is probably what we need to do in order to actually manage our environment a little bit. And I don't know where that line is, but I'm fascinated by it, and I'm doing the research that I can to figure out where I think that is. So in terms of how this piece was constructed, most of the material that I use in terms of wood is found or somehow sourced magically. It's kind of like arrived, it arrives, or someone tells you about it, and then you go and drag it out of your yard, or drag it out of the river, or drag it out of the whatever. And in this case, all of the legs and the structural pieces on this piece are all cedar, red cedar. They all came from a single log, and that log was a reject log at the mill. It had a long sweep to it, so it's a kind of a long elbow or bend, and you can see that in the legs. If you stand on the other side, you can see that long curve. So it's not, they couldn't cut straight boards out of it. For them, it's a waste. They don't want that log, and it stays out in the yard. The other part of it was that the tree had heart rot, which is really common in cedars, and so the carpenter ants had moved into the core of the tree and hollowed that out. So I took that log and cut it into sections and divided it up into 7 legs, and spaced them out, and came up with this ability to make this a little bit more of a sweeping conical shape. I wanted that idea of fluidity and movement and not the rigidity of a straight line form. From that point, so that we built this structure, and I almost always worked with an assistant in the studio on large pieces like this. It's hard to you just don't have enough mass, body mass or arms and legs to hold things in place while you're working on them. So the next step was to build kind of a skeleton around it of steel, and we used that to bend the wooden form. So the wood, this form, which is covered in just a thin layer of steel, is actually about 2 inches thick of 1/8 inch thick layers of wood veneer. So I had come across a whole unit of wood veneers, and they're very flexible in one direction, and so we bend them on that steel form and staple them together and glue the layers. And once you get those layers glued together, then they will hold in that shape in a rigid form. So there's layers and layers of wood inside that make up this large kind of twisted curved form. And then the outer surface is covered with sheet metal and fastened on like an old riveted boiler plate kind of structure. So it gives it some. They're shingled, so it sheds water. It's kind of impervious. It's this kind of impenetrable thing from the outside. What's that?
It might need to adhere.
Right. Well, it struck me that yesterday that somebody mentioned that they felt like it was kind of this really hard, firm form from the outside, but when they stepped inside, it took a very different character. And that's what I wanted to do. Is it's all a nice wood surface inside, and it's very warm and feels entirely opposite of the outside of the form. And I want people to be drawn into these things.
It's not unsafe for our visitors to.
Oh, absolutely not.
They can
You can.
explore.
I'm not going to tell you to climb on it, but you could. No, it's absolutely a sturdy form, and you can be inside. And I encourage you to come inside and to kind of, touch it, and you're not going to damage the sculpture. So, encourage people to walk through and around and over. I'm a believer that this scale of artwork really should be able to be interacted with, and I want that interaction. I think for a long time the work that I was doing was creating spaces for people to kind of visualize themselves inside the work, and now as the scale has changed, I'm really interested in the way in which people interact with space and how an object can change a space. So I want you to be drawn into it. We put the blocks in place so that you can sit with the piece. Initially, the blocks on their first display were underneath the piece so that you actually did sit down inside the piece, and it became its own sheltering space. So that idea of shaping in the same way that architecture shapes our environment, I think that the sculpture can function in that way as well. And the piece changes the architecture, right? This is a fantastic space out here, this atrium space, and it's minimalist architecture with hard surfaces of steel, and then you put a warm object in here and it suddenly changes the way in which you react. It changes our personal scale, and those things are all kind of driving forces in the work that I'm doing at larger scale. So the last few pieces I've done are large plaza designs. So we just finished a plaza for the Oregon State Veterans Home in Lebanon, Oregon, and that one is intended also to kind of pull you into the plaza, and then it has an upright series of 5 poles and a canopy. So there's a sense of closure even though you're outdoors, And then there's a seating arrangement below and a water element in the middle, 40,000 pounds of basalt columns.
Will that be on your webpage?
Yes, that will be shortly. We just got the lighting done last week, so.
So we can do that, we can look up these artists on the computer and see other work and become more familiar.
So that idea of specifically there, creating a space for the residents and the veterans to enjoy the outdoors and have their own place was interesting and engaging. Same idea. I want people to be drawn into the work, to spend time in the work, and have it. I think maybe see something familiar through a different lens. You know, seeing these out in the forest is one thing, but seeing them landed in here is
It was really fun watching you put it together. They were hoisting and moving, and it was
How
really.
much does it weigh?
This one weighs about 3,500 pounds. We moved it several times for other opportunities. We showed it by moving it all in one piece in the past. So we can pick it up and lay it down on the trailer, and then this leg comes off because it's too tall to go down the highway otherwise. But then we could stand the whole thing up in one piece. In this case, we discussed on the telephone, well, this piece seems perfect, can we put it in the gallery? And I said, well, how big is there a roll-up door we can drive through? And no, there isn't. So we cut the whole piece apart. So the outer skin is actually in 6 pieces, and the frame all comes apart and is bolted together. So we just reassembled it back in here, and the goal was to disassemble it and reassemble it and make it look like we didn't do that, so that it's all still looks like it's one piece together. And it is, I mean, it's not, we didn't sacrifice any of its sturdiness to do that, but it was a puzzle that was, you know, a fun puzzle to think about for, and these things are kind of like I mold them over for a couple of months and then come in for a week and make it happen. So, but it came apart really well and it went back together in a couple days.
So the cone itself usually stands for, I'm not from the Northwest,
Yes.
so I've never seen one of these.
Okay.
But your artistic license, in order to get the fluidity, has
Right.
changed the direction of the legs, so we get that movement.
Typically, they're very symmetrical form, and they have a big wire cage dome over the top that catches sparks.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a spark arrestor. And so there's a hole in the side that the conveyor runs up into, and wood continuously falls into that burner, and it's burning, and smoke is billowing out of the top of it. So yes, I love that sense of movement. I mean, they're anchored to the ground, and I've lifted the spiral up off the ground to give it some lift, and also played with the idea of a spiral instead of everything happening down here at a single level. I want that idea of it twisting so that when you do step inside, you want to look up through the space. You know, I want to lead the eye. That's the
How about other questions? Anybody have
I
any?
need to say that I was so excited to see you dealing with the concept of the burner, because as a child seeing these occasionally, and it was very infrequently, that there was a sobriety about those forms that are like a crematorium. Essentially, they have that much power and sobriety. And I was taken as a graduate student many years ago to draw them and understand your, maybe understand your impulse to work with the form, because they're so powerful. But I love the translation you added to it as a moving form. And it's great to be underneath there and really enjoyable to interact. And I like that we can stand up in there, have our heads in.
Right.
So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So people are allowed to go in, people are allowed to go inside.
Yes, he's encouraging you to go.
Yeah, you can find
It's
this
not
is-
unsafe.
This is intended to kind of pull you in here through this step. And, if you haven't been through it, you should have that experience so that you can encourage other people to have that experience as well.
My question is, I have friends in Eugene who would love to see this. May I photograph this?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
That was a question, photographs.
Yeah.
Everything you photographed?
If you have any
Just
problems, I'm fine with
Just
it.
no flash, right?
I'm fine with however they need to post with their naughty. Well, thank you for coming.
We did, that's a good question. We actually did burn the surface of the whole interior of the sculpture and the legs, and then we sanded back the parts we wanted to expose the grain, the wood grain. So, yeah, it's a burner that's been burned. So, that's the title of the show is
The
Burn.
charcoal's on that.
The charcoal is real charcoal, yeah. And I like the idea of the way that it kind of warmed up the gallery space a little bit. It took a little bit of the sharp edge out.
Yeah.
And also, you know, as we were putting it out the other night, and it was very late and we were kind of exhausted, but I kept thinking about the beach and the drifts of wood that come through. And so we're going to go to the South Beach today and look at some driftwood and play around there.
Cool.
See what we can find. So, but what's that?
Good enough.